I'm really excited to be here this evening, and particularly with our distinguished panel, who I am going to introduce in just a moment. First, I'd like to give you a little bit of background on why we're here tonight. JCRC believes that Israel is integral to modern Jewish identity. 10 years ago, JCRC issued its last statement on Israel. In that statement, we reiterated our support for constructive efforts towards peace and acknowledged that there are a variety of views on the Arab-Israeli conflict. We also, as one of the first JCRCs in the country, took a position in favor of a two-state solution. This statement has stood the test of time, as have our prior statements on Israel, and it continues to be relevant today. While the hope for a political settlement right now seems distant, JCRC continues to support efforts toward peace and a two-state solution through efforts such as our Invest in Peace campaign. Invest in Peace highlights NGOs and businesses that are doing outstanding people-to-people coexistence work in the region. These organizations such as Ultimate Peace, Middle East Entrepreneurs of Tomorrow, Zaytun Ventures, Project Rosanna, are paving the way for a peaceful future for Israelis and Palestinians. And we're thrilled that we have over 200 prominent leaders in the Bay Area who have signed on to our campaign, and over 80,000 likes on our Facebook page, which is really good news considering how this topic typically plays out in the Bay Area. So please visit our Facebook page. This is just a little bit of an advertisement. Investinpeace.org is our website, and we also have materials in the back, and we have a really cool poster that says "Coexistence is Resistance." That you should see. So as I mentioned, it's been 10 years since we wrote a consensus statement on Israel, and the town hall this evening, as well as our prior two town halls, the last one on engaging Zionism and the prior one on the First Amendment and Israel on campus, are part of a year-long process to write a new statement, this time on the delegitimization of Israel. And I just want to say, give a quick shout out to those who are on our Middle East Strategy Committee, who have been tasked with writing this statement and have done an incredible job. Can I see a few hands of folks just be recognized, those that are here? Thank you. So on this topic this evening, criticism of Israel and anti-Semitism, it is, as Sarah mentioned, quite timely. As our country gets more divided, rhetoric about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has also become more divisive and in some cases extreme. At the same time, we've seen a dramatic rise in anti-Semitic incidents around the country, as well as the corrosive effects of the BDS movement on our college campuses and elsewhere. Most of us would probably agree that criticism of the policies of the State of Israel is not inherently anti-Semitic, even harsh criticism. Sometimes, however, criticism of Israel can cross the line into overt anti-Semitism, and sometimes it's used as a cover or a deflection for anti-Semitic attitudes by claiming that those who raise the issue of anti-Semitism are doing so as part of a secret plan to shut down this criticism. There are, of course, robust differences of opinion as to where that line is and how best to respond, and that's part of what we're here this evening to discuss. And our panel will be exploring when and how criticism of Israel crosses the line into anti-Semitism, how it plays out in the community, how it relates to other forms of bigotry, and how we can address it in a productive way. In just a few moments, we'll hear from our panelists. After our panel discussion, we look forward to hearing from you. There are question cards that will be passed out, and if you need a pencil, please let one of our staff know. And as we're going, please write these cards and just raise your hand if you would like your card to be collected. We'll also be passing out a survey on the topic this evening, and we look forward to hearing your thoughts. Finally, as a reminder, we recognize a wide range of viewpoints in the room tonight on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and we welcome them. Respectful listening and speaking are essential. We call on those here this evening to engage in mutual respect, even when there's strong disagreement. Any attempts to interrupt or disrupt the program or uncivil behavior, we will ask people to leave. So we really appreciate your cooperation and engagement. Thank you. So, Reverend Kaloma Smith was born in Jamaica and reared in Mount Vernon, New York. Pastor Smith has a background both in corporate and spiritual worlds, serving in churches on the East Coast as well as in sales, and later as Senior Managing Director of Home Theater of Long Island. That changed in 2013 when he was handpicked to lead the nearly 100-year-old University African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church in Palo Alto. Reverend Smith has a bachelor's degree in behavior science from Concordia University and currently lives in Santa Clara, California. I also had the excellent pleasure of traveling to Israel with Reverend Smith in the fall on a trip with Shalom Hartman Institute. Vlad Khaykin, did I get that right? Okay, is the Associate Regional Director for the Anti-Defamation League. Born in the Soviet Union, he arrived in the U.S. in 1989 as a refugee. Vlad was raised in the Bay Area and studied economics and business management at the UC Santa Cruz and received dual master's degree in nonprofit leadership and Near Eastern and Judaic studies at Brandeis University. Vlad has worked in a variety of nonprofits and at the JCRC of Greater Boston and the American Jewish Committee in Philadelphia. Rabbi Melanie Aron has been the rabbi of Congregation Shir Hadash in Los Gatos since 1990. She was trained at Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion. After ordination, she served in congregations in New Jersey and New York. Rabbi Aron has served on various local and national boards and is involved in many interfaith activities, including People Acting in Community Together, Silicon Valley Faces, and in interfaith dialogues with the Muslim community. So I welcome our panelists. So I would like to start us off by asking Vlad to please give us a little bit of background to frame our conversation. We know that anti-Semitism is on the rise. Can you give us a few statistics? What are we talking about and how does that play out here in the Bay Area?
Sure. Everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
All right, thank you. So first of all, thank you for having me on this panel. I'm honored to share the dais with these folks up here. Intolerance is up around the country, right? And it's not just the Jewish community that is feeling the heat. In fact, the FBI has recorded for the second year in a row double-digit increases in hate crimes across the board. All right, this is hate crimes against Jews, against Muslims, against immigrants, Hispanic community, certainly the Black community. For the extent of the time that the FBI has been recording hate crimes, Jews have always figured amongst the most frequent targets for hate crimes. And according to our research at the ADL, anti-Semitic incidents are up nearly 60% over the last year. This is the largest single-year increase in anti-Semitism that we have on record since we began tracking this decades ago. Right? And this nearly 60% increase in anti-Semitic incidents is over and above the previous year, which already saw a more than 30% increase in anti-Semitic incidents. So it's a growing problem, and it's one that certainly we're very concerned about at ADL, but it's also something that for the first time we've seen the American populace become concerned with. Our survey showed for the very first time that a majority of Americans are concerned about violence directed against Jews. We've never found that to be true. And of course, there's a similar concern about other communities. For example, nearly 3/4, I believe, of the American populace has expressed a concern over violence against Muslims as well. Right? So this is a shared problem.
And how do you see it manifesting here in the Bay Area?
Yeah, so it manifests in a number of ways. We see anti-Semitism in our businesses, right, where we've had a dentist office that was defaced and vandalized with swastikas and other racist graffiti. We see it while shopping in the supermarket, where a Jewish individual was knocked down by another person who yelled, you effing Jews take up too much space. Get out of my space. We see it certainly online, where we've seen the proliferation of hatred. We recorded over the last year about 4.2 million anti-Semitic tweets. And we see it in our places of worship, where we've had a case a bit up north, where an imam during Friday night, his Friday night sermon was basically saying very violently anti-Semitic genocidal kind of things. We see it on the freeway on our way to work, where people a few months back were holding a banner that said the Holocaust is a lie. We see it in our homes, right? I don't know if any of you have received robocalls from the campaign of Patrick Little. He's an openly anti-Semitic, white nationalist who says that his agenda is to create a Jew-free America. And his campaign has been doing robocalls here in the Bay Area and across California, calling his opponent that he's running against, Dianne Feinstein, a traitorous Jew, right? And of course, perhaps most troubling for us, we see it in our schools, right, where we've had incidents not too far from here where a number of Jewish and Israeli students were threatened through social media with Holocaust imagery and threats of violence. And of course, as we all know, our college campuses are rife with anti-Semitism. In fact, the figure that I cited earlier about a 60% increase in anti-Semitic incidents on college campuses, it's actually doubled in just 1 year, right? So, and this is, and it's coming from fellow students. It's coming from sometimes the administration, where Jewish individuals as well as Jewish on-campus groups and institutions like Hillel are feeling increasingly marginalized. So it's a really pervasive problem, including here in the Bay Area, where we kind of think of ourselves as this bastion of progressive politics and tolerance and diversity and multiculturalism.
So let's step back a moment. Can you define anti-Semitism, or what is ADL's official definition?
Yeah, so definitions are important, right? They help us to kind of understand what are the contours of the issues that we're trying to deal with an eye to, obviously, to address the particular problems. But definitions can also constrain us, right? No definition is ever going to be exhaustive or comprehensive, and so when you have things that fall outside of any kind of standardized definition, then people can just say, like, oh, it's not anti-Semitic because, look, the definition says A and this is clearly B. So there's a danger too. So on our website and in our literature, you'll find various kind of iterations and definitions of anti-Semitism. They're all fairly similar, but we always caution that it's not a comprehensive or exhaustive definition. But I'll just read it to you. So anti-Semitism is a form of prejudice that is directed against Jews as individuals or as a group. Anti-Semitism is often based on age-old stereotypes and myths that target Jews as a people, their religious practices and beliefs, or the Jewish state of Israel. And obviously this is not the only definition, and not everybody necessarily agrees with it either.
Thank you. Speaking of that, would Reverend Smith or Rabbi Aron have a slightly different definition, or is there something you would add to that definition?
So I think that's a helpful definition. It certainly touches on some very important issues. Anti-Semitism is often called the longest hatred because of its very long history, its roots in theological anti-Semitism, but it certainly is manifest in other kinds of ways. I think it's important to touch on the scapegoating aspect of anti-Semitism, that rich and poor are both the victims and also the perpetrators of anti-Semitism. And it's unprovable, not because the accusations are unproven, but because they're created in such a way that they are unprovable, that's the nature of the trope and the conspiracy. If it's all right with you, I'd take a moment just to talk about the issue of colleges. I know people are very concerned about anti-Semitism on colleges, and we certainly have one example in San Francisco of a college that's really way at the extreme in terms of the problem of anti-Semitism. But Steinhardt did a major study in 2017 of anti-Semitism on college campuses and the impact on college students, and it was a little bit encouraging, and I think it needs to be shared along with some of the statistics, which can be very alarming. Most college students did not report feeling a hostile environment at college. Most have not themselves heard an anti-Semitic remark, though they have frequently heard an anti-Israel remark. Most college students feel that the support for BDS on their campuses is rare. They feel safe and they feel that they belong. And I think that's important, even if some campuses would be outstandingly negative in this, to understand that most American Jewish college students are pursuing their academic careers without a great deal of interference. Mark Udoff, the former head of the UC system, speaks about this frequently. Some of you have probably heard him. And he says that we can do damage by overstating this issue, by disregarding issues of freedom of speech, and by making accusations of anti-Semitism where they're unwarranted. So I think we need to keep a balanced perspective to encourage our students to feel safe, to support them when they don't feel safe, but not to paint an overly bleak picture of what life is like on college campuses. And some of us who are at the Zionism 2.0 and 3.0 over at the JCRC, you heard college students even from Berkeley say, yes, there are problems, but you know what? We want to handle the problems on our own campus. And we need to remember that that's part of being a college student as well. So thank you.
Thank you. So let's go into criticism of Israel and how it relates to anti-Semitism, which is our topic tonight. Is there a particular line? Is there a particular point? Where would you say it crosses the line? Because we talk about a lot about that, but is there a specific place where you would say, yes, that absolutely is anti-Semitism?
I think in order to frame the conversation, we also have to be 100% honest that the current environment in America is very polarized, and it's also very negative on many issues. Doesn't matter what the issue is, it's almost a zero-sum game. And this is where you become very dangerous in dealing with others' existence. When we deal with race or Israel, and when you start denying the existence of another person or the pain of another person or the issue of another person, that's when it becomes anti-Semitic, anti-Muslim, anti-Black, whatever it is. Because my point becomes, if I'm right, you can't exist. And that is extremely dangerous. And we'll talk about it a little bit later, but I also find it unbiblical and poor theology on top of that, because it's just is.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a number of tools or guidelines that we can kind of use to figure out what's what, right? To distinguish legitimate criticism, political dissent from Israeli policies, or criticism of Israeli politicians from what crosses the line into anti-Semitism. But as with, as I said, with any definition, nothing is ever going to be comprehensive, and it's also going to be limiting in some ways. But I would say that there are a number of kind of things that we can, definitely identify as crossing the line, right? So if you're engaging in kind of classical examples of anti-Semitic rhetoric, right? So this would be things like the blood libel, right? So that you all know that there's this notion that's, at least probably about 1,000 years old at this point, the notion that Jews subsisted on the bodies of Christian children, right? Specifically drinking their blood, using the blood in specifically Passover rituals and so on. Today these have been repackaged, right, and found new life. So you'll hear not uncommonly, for example, particularly in the Middle East, that the Israelis are arresting Palestinian children. Why? To harvest their organs. Right? I mean, this is a modern blood libel. And we can distinguish it from criticism that is constructive and advances us towards some kind of peace in the Middle East, from just vitriol, because saying that Jews are harvesting the organs of Palestinian children and that's why they're arresting children, that doesn't actually get us anywhere, right? This isn't some kind of critique of a policy that could be said to be legitimate. It's just regurgitating age-old myths that have been used to foment violence against Jewish communities for centuries, right? There's a number of things. So actually the State Department of the United States has a definition of anti-Semitism, and it includes anti-Semitism as it relates to Israel, right? And it draws upon Natan Sharansky's 3D test of anti-Semitism, right? So are you all familiar with Natan Sharansky's? Okay, so the 3D test, the 3 Ds are dehumanization, or I would also say demonization, delegitimization, and double standards. Right? So if you engage in any of those, then you are engaging in anti-Semitism. I just want to note that at ADL, we try not to discuss human beings as being anti-Semites, right? We talk about actions, words, rhetoric, policies, etc., as being anti-Semitic in nature. We don't like to say, you are an anti-Semite, right? To discuss somebody's character or their being as being fundamentally or inherently racist, discriminatory, bigoted, and so on. So I think the 3D test is imperfect, but it can serve as a guideline for helping us parse some of these issues.
So again, I can agree that there's healthy criticism of policies, criticism even of government officials. That's part of what makes a democracy run. But sometimes Israel is singled out in a way that's reminiscent of the way that Jews were singled out. And that would fall under the category of illegitimate. It's also the sense that imperfection in Israel is considered a grounds for illegitimacy, whereas here in the United States we recognize our democracy is imperfect. We don't provide equal justice for all. Our foreign policy has done a lot of damage around the world. But that just motivates us to fight to do better in the future. It doesn't declare our country illegitimate. And then there's the issue that Vlad raised of rhetorical language. Israel gets a lot more attention than a lot of other countries. So many worse things happen in other places and they're not reported on as much. And in some ways that's very natural. First of all, Israel is in a certain way part of the Western world. It's very relatable. America and Israel have strong ties, so that gets it into the American press more. Plus, it's a very comfortable place for reporters. You can go report on something very dangerous, then you can come home and sleep in your nice, cozy hotel and be nice and safe. So it gives Israel a lot more attention, and I think that's true. But when that attention turns into rhetoric, Zionist faith killers, genocide, a denial of the history of the ties of the Jewish people to the land of Israel, or the history of the Holocaust, then it crosses over a line. It goes beyond criticism.
And what about strong language that some would say is a political judgment versus anti-Semitism? Things like using the word apartheid to criticize Israel, or that Israelis or the early Zionist Jews were colonizers.
Want to take that one?
I thought we were playing hot potato with that one. We were discussing this when we first got here, and I think where people present unsophisticated comparisons. If you've ever gone to the Middle East, the one thing that I left with, there are no angels there. It's very complicated, it's very different than what it is. I grew up in New York, have a lot of Jewish friends, and I love Carnegie Deli when it was open. I love cats. I love a bagel with lard. But then I went to Israel, and I looked over here and I was like, "Where's the deli?" It's just Jewish food, right? Where's my deli? That's the point. You can't take something that has a South African context and apply it to someplace else different. That's just poor reporting, that's poor political talk, that's playing on emotions, that is bad correlation. And people oftentimes, to get on whichever news channel you watch, MSNBC, CNN, Fox, whichever part of the spectrum you fall in, it's easy for somebody to say, this country's like apartheid, instead of saying, this country has very complicated issues that require us to work through.
I'll jump on that for a minute. It's the joke about the guy who has a hammer so everything looks like a nail. The progressive movement was successful fighting apartheid, and so that becomes the model for everything. So everything has to look like that, whereas if you look at Israel more carefully, and you're looking for other parallels, South Africa isn't the best parallel. Let's talk about India and Pakistan, and the British and their contribution. There are other analogies, but that takes just a little bit more sophistication and not that immediate response. Let's put a target on it.
Yeah, I just want to touch on the specific trope of colonization, right? Colonialism is always juxtaposed against the colonized people, right? And often what you find is it's spoken about, there's a juxtaposition between the colonizers and the indigenous peoples, right? the Jews are indigenous to the Eastern Mediterranean, right? Nobody's confused about that, right? In terms of genetics, the historical record, linguistics, archaeology, anthropology. I mean, we're more or less in agreement on those fronts that this is where the Jews, Jewish culture, the Jewish language, the Jewish religion, Jewish genetics, that's where they originate, right? So the Jews are in fact indigenous to that region. And have been amongst the most frequently colonized people in history. Talk about the Greeks, the Romans, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Ottomans, the Brits, etc., 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 countless times. The story of Israel is not one of a foreign people. This isn't the Dutch in the Congo coming to a place where they have absolutely no place being, to subjugate the indigenous people there, to expropriate wealth. This is an entirely different story. This is a story of an indigenous people being ethnically cleansed by colonial powers from their indigenous lands, and then 2,000 years later, returning en masse to reclaim their independence. And I think people have to be very careful when they use that kind of inflammatory language to call an indigenous people the colonizers.
Inflammatory, but what is it anti-Semitic?
The reality is, in an American context, particularly from African American, I'm looking at a room of white people. I am. And when you say colonizers, the majority of people are white. So it becomes very easy to if you're not very sophisticated and you don't do research and you don't look at the thing and realize it's more of a colonial issue. That's why you have areas like Rwanda where there are different tribes fighting over land, or Pakistan and India where you see indigenous groups fighting. But again, it becomes very dangerous when you place an American context on it and say, well, they're white, they have to be colonizers, right? No, I'm being dead serious. And it becomes that thing because, and the reality that whiteness is a very American invention, right? And for whatever other structures that creates in America, you have the hangover, and we'll talk about that later, but you have the hangover of perception. So when those that are reckless or making bad correlations, it's such an easy thing to lay into the American psyche. Oh, they have to be colonizers. Look, it doesn't require any science, it doesn't require any research, it doesn't require anything. It just says, look.
Well, and it also doesn't require an appreciation for the nuances of Jewish history, right? Because I come from the Soviet Union. Trust that we were not considered white there, right? In fact, every Jew on the fifth line of their passport, the fifth line identified you by your ethnic background, they identified us as Jewish. And if you were identified as Jewish, you were surely going to be subjected to every form of discrimination, housing discrimination, educational discrimination, employment discrimination, on and on and on. And this it touches on another point, which is that the whiteness of American Jewry is also a fairly recent concept, right? And the other issue to consider is that many Jews kind of accepted when they were allowed into the society of the white people, they did so because to be white, if you could fit in, it meant that you could escape the persecution, escape the discrimination, right? And escape violence in some cases. So it was a matter of survival to try to blend in, right? Like, my name is Vlad, right? Like, it's not something Hebrew sounding. My parents are here in the audience. Why do you think they gave me the name Vlad as opposed to something that would out me as being Jewish in a society where anti-Semitism was rife? It was a matter of survival, right? And I think that needs to be appreciated.
Yeah, I think there's one other aspect to this. We look out at American Jews and we see people from Central Europe and Eastern Europe. But if we look at an audience in Israel, we would look very different. More than half of Israeli Jews are Mizrahi Jews. They're Jews from Arab countries, they're Jews from North Africa. And we are so Eurocentric. Vlad mentioned in passing the return of the Jews. So I'm taking a trip to Israel this summer, actually in 2 weeks, with a congregation. We're going to Spain and to Israel. And this is why we're doing that, because last time I was in Israel, I was at the Eretz Yisrael Museum in Tel Aviv, and they had an exhibit about banking in the 19th century in Israel. And I'm thinking, who needed banks in Israel in the 19th century? A bunch of Ashkenazi schnorrers, these old people who came to die, they don't need banking. There was a whole Sephardic community that existed there, with merchants who had empires that traded all over the world. So we tell even the Jewish story in a very Eurocentric way. And we need to remember that the Jewish people are not all Europeans, and that as much as the Holocaust played a role in the founding of Israel, most Israelis are not Holocaust refugees or Holocaust survivors. That's a very, very small minority of the people living in Israel today. So that statement that the problems of Europe got dumped on the Palestinians in Israel is more complicated. As you said, everything is more complicated, and the people who live in Israel come also from the Middle East, the Jewish people as well.
So let's turn to something related that we hear a lot about, anti-Zionism. Zionism and anti-Zionism. It's really a buzzword, and in some cases used in a very negative way, particularly here in the Bay Area. Does anti-Zionism in and of itself constitute anti-Semitism? Why or why not?
That's not my question.
I'll start and you can see. So I really like history, so I'll go back just a little bit. Until 1967, American Jews didn't identify so much as Zionists. It really is a very recent phenomenon. Now, there was a period after 67 where everyone thought that identification with Israel is going to replace all other forms of Judaism. Close down the synagogues. We won't need them anymore because everyone is just going to have this Israeli identification. That's what's going to make them Jewish. And things have changed. But even looking further back, not everybody was a Zionist. In the 19th century, there are Yiddishists who believe in the primacy of Jewish life outside the land of Israel. And our Reform movement, though we like to pretend sometimes it wasn't the case, believed in the primacy of Jewish life here in America. We weren't going to rebuild the temple. We weren't going to resume the animal sacrifices. Had a very different point of view. So Zionism is not all of Judaism. Not all Jews have to be Zionists. But when we deny Zionism, we're denying something very important to Judaism. And I think Americans tend to have a hard time with Zionism, with the idea that the Jewish people need a country. Why should there be a Jewish country? Americans will often say to me. Now, part of the answer is Vlad's experience, that outside of America, being Jewish was your nationality. Jewish wasn't written on his identity paper in the place where you wrote religion. It was where you would write Ukrainian or whatever your nationality was. And all through Jewish life in Europe, Jews were a nationality. Nationalities have nations, they have countries. So I think that's a hard thing for Americans to understand because we think of Judaism so much as Catholic, Protestant, and Jew, as if it's just a religious heritage. The other thing that I find Americans have a lot of difficulty with is the idea of a religious country because we have separation of church and state here. Long may it continue, it's very important for Jewish life, but that's not everywhere. I went to elementary school in England. In Manchester, guess what? England has an established church, the Church of England. And Church of England was taught in the public schools, and I had release time as a dissenter, even though I was a dissenter, and I had separate education. So I don't think the measure of democracy is whether a country has an established religion. It's really how you treat minorities. So you can have an established religion. France has an established religion. Many, many countries have established religions. There's nothing wrong or negative about that. And I think that's important when we talk about Zionism, to remember that the Jewish people have been a people, and that many countries have established religions. The United States doesn't, but other countries do, and they maintain their democracy.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point that a lot of people misunderstand about who Jews are, right? You know, we oftentimes in the American context, or really in the Western context, think of Jews as, you know, Americans or, you know, Brits or whoever who happen to be of the Jewish faith, right? In general, the bifurcation between nation and religion is a fairly modern and you know, Western-centric concept in many ways. Indigenous people generally don't recognize such a bifurcation, right? So, you know, you think of other indigenous groups, they are ethno groups with a religion, right? They are not like the Lakota are not a religion, they have a religion, right? The Jewish people are not a religion, we have a religion that is indigenous to our group, but you can't summarize what it means to be Jewish by saying it's this collection of beliefs and rituals, right? You're going to miss it. right? And so, and we've always thought of ourselves as more than just a religion. There's nowhere in the Torah, for example, where we're described as a religious community, right? We're described as an right? As a nation, as a people, right? So we've always thought of ourselves that way. And in fact, the very word Jew comes from Judah, which is an ancestral designation coming from a particular tribe of the Jewish people, not a religious one, right? So on the question of Zionism, I think, the first question that needs to be asked is, what are we talking about, right? I find that so often when I have these conversations with people who, maybe consider themselves even anti-Zionist, there's very little understanding of what Zionism actually is. So that's the first thing that we need to parse is, what are you actually talking about? What it turns out they're actually talking about more often than not when I'm talking to anti-Zionists, I can only speak from my own experience, but is that they're drawing, their sense of Zionism is something drawn from the protocols of the elders of Zion, right? Which is something that most people who consider themselves to be Zionists would fully reject as an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, right? So what is it that we're talking about when we talk about Zionism, I think is an important question. Is anti-Zionism inherently anti-Semitic? Well, no, I don't think it is. But I would say that there's a very large overlap. Not a total overlap, but a very large overlap. One can certainly imagine, one can identify a number of ways that one could be anti-Zionist but not anti-Semitic, right? So for example, if you are of an anarchist political persuasion and reject nation states on principle, right, for any people, then that is a position that is consistently applied to all people. It's not singling out the Jews and saying the Jews of all the nations are the only ones who are not allowed the right to self-determine, allowed to have a state of their own, and so on. We can also, we also know that there's a number of religious perspectives that are anti-Zionist on the basis of their theology, right? You have, ultra-Orthodox groups like Natrei Karda who are not quite anti-Zionist. I call them not quite yet Zionist, right? Because what they're actually, they're just waiting for the Messiah to return, at which point they will be the most zealous Zionist that you've ever met, right? With a religious fervor. So they're not quite anti-Zionist, but in the present moment they consider themselves anti-Zionist. But is it anti-Semitic? Well, no. It's based on an interpretation of Scripture that you can argue is right, you can argue is wrong, but it's not really anti-Semitic. So, no, anti-Zionism is not inherently anti-Semitic, but more often than not, I think it can be used as a proxy, or the Zionists can be used as a metonymic dog whistle, to talk about Jews, right? If you go to any white supremacist website or go to David Duke's Twitter, you'll see him going off about Zionist this and Zionist that. He means Jews.
And do you see a different interpretation of Zionism, anti-Zionism, and really the anti-Semitism that you see coming from the left and the right? So when David Duke talks about it, is it any different than when a far left talks about it?
Well, so for us as an organization, we're not so concerned on which side of the political spectrum anti-Semitism is coming from. We really want to make sure that anti-Semitism does not become a game of partisan political football, because when that happens, the Jews always lose, right? If your only concern about anti-Semitism is insofar as you can use it as a cudgel against your political enemies, then you're not really concerned about anti-Semitism, right? And then you're not really an ally to the Jewish people. So we're less concerned about which side of the spectrum it's coming from, and more about what it is itself. But what I will say is that what's keeping me and my colleagues at ADL up at night increasingly is that the rhetoric, the anti-Semitic rhetoric coming from the left, the far left and the far right, increasingly is indistinguishable, right? So I can just give you an example. There's a professor at Columbia, Hamid Dabashi, who recently said on his Twitter, he said, "Every dirty, treacherous, ugly, and pernicious act happening in the world, just wait for a few days and the ugly name of Israel will pop up." Right? Compare this to the statement from Andrew Anglin, who's he's the proprietor of the most popular white supremacist website on the internet, The Daily Stormer. "The Jews are the beginning and the end of every problem, from poverty to poor family dynamics to war to the destruction of the rainforest." Are we relieved that the first guy said Israel and not the Jews? I'm not. The rainforest.
Oh, wow.
the relationship between anti-Semitism and other forms of bigotry? Do you see it play out differently than other forms of bigotry, or is it similar?
It does not play out differently, but it weighs differently because of historic context. I think each group that receives its own form of bigotry, there is a historic long tail behind it. So how a Latino person experiences implicit bias at the store in New York City when people say you need to speak English, not Spanish, or African American male feels it when a police officer uses excessive violence, or how somebody feels when on a college campus and they're Jewish and they hear about certain things. It's not that they're each individually different. There's a historic precedent that puts it behind it. I think the really critical part about our country is the utter boldness and unmitigated gall of people to think it's all right. We've become so uncivilized, and we revel in it for whatever reason. And then when somebody calls you on it, it becomes, oh, that's your opinion. It becomes a dog whistle. Oh, don't bring out the race card. Don't bring out the anti-Semitic card. Don't bring out this card. And I find that it's just descending us deeper into the muck. That's why I'm here tonight, because I believe that we need to continue to elevate conversations across the board so that we can have more effective community life and we can learn to work together better. The other thing that really bothers me is language like, let's make America great again. I don't know about you, but in the 1930s and 40s, there was Jim Crow laws, and he picked on Jewish neighborhoods, and it wasn't great for me. Was it great for you?
No.
But that whole undertone of make it great again so I can feel comfortable. And Karen Eisenberg wrote an amazing book called White Trash, which talks about how they use class and culture to play against the other. And I think with the dissolution of American industry and a lot of other factors and the dissolution of American middle class, there are forces in this world that are preying on people's deepest and primal fears and pointing to whether it be the Black, the Jew, the Latino, the Muslim, anybody but the fact that they didn't open the factory, they didn't keep their political promise. And that is what the dangerous thing is. The target changes every day, but they'll always target somebody to blame for something.
Those are really important words, and I think many of us remember neighborhoods where Jews couldn't buy houses, GE not hiring Jewish engineers, and the past was not so beautiful. And the legislation that helped the African American community helped the Jewish community as well. I want to go back to what Vlad talked about with the anti-Semitism on the right and the left. What I learned from the ADL as a young rabbinic student was that in America, there's always going to be a small group that loves Jews, and there's always going to be a small group that hates Jews, and the real thing you want to keep your eye on is what's happening in the middle. And I guess that's what concerns me, where I wonder whether anti-Semitism on the left and anti-Semitism on the right are the same, because how central are the people who are anti-Semitic on the right to the enterprise of government, and how central are the people on the left? Farrakhan says terrible things, but he's not a leader in that sense. So that's a concern. Anti-Semitism is a lot like racism in that it kind of looks at biological traits and then turns them into character and says that's what determines who you are. But it's also, anti-Semitism and racism are different in the sense that racism has been an all-on all the time, and anti-Semitism tends to ebb and flow. And I think that makes it harder to see sometimes on the outside when there's a period of time that Jews appear to be people of privilege, and they're very visible in positive ways, and then intermittent anti-Semitism comes back.
Yeah, so look, anti-Semitism, the anti-Jewish animus is going to be expressed in the terms that are most congruent with the ideas and the language in the particular space in which they're expressed, and in the ways that are going to garner the most amount of praise and social capital for the speaker, right? So if you're in a leftist space, attacks against Jews are going to take the form of, blaming Jews for being responsible for capitalism. If you're on the far right, attacks against Jews are going to take the form of, blaming the Jews for being responsible for communism. On the right, you're going to, have attacks against Jews for promoting open border policies and flooding our country with these brown immigrants. And on the left, you're going to get accusations that the Jews are the ones who are teaching our, far right how to deport immigrants and how to build walls and all these things, right? So that's one thing I wanted to add. In terms of the relationship of anti-Semitism to other forms of bigotry, or what I sometimes like to refer to as misanthropes, so obviously they all share a number of things in common, right? There's the dehumanization of people, there's demonization, stripping folks of their individuality and seeing them as a homogeneous mass that you already kind of know everything about, right? So there's a number of shared traits, but each form of bigotry has its own unique characteristics as well, right? Anti-black racism doesn't look exactly like anti-Semitism, which doesn't look exactly like misogyny, which doesn't look exactly like any of the other things. They have their own unique traits, but they're all interlinked, and I mean that in certainly in the general sense of injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, but also in a very precise sense. One of the best voices, I think, on anti-Semitism right now is a man by the name of Aron. He's an African-American, longtime civil rights activist, researcher of white supremacist, extremist ideologies. And he says that anti-Semitism is the fuel the white nationalist ideology uses to power its anti-black racism, its contempt for other people of color, and its xenophobia, as well as its misogyny and other forms of hatred it holds dear. Right? When I tell people this, people are sometimes confused. Like, what's the relationship? White supremacy had a problem, right? With the victories of the civil rights movement, they had a problem. If white people are really supreme and superior to everybody else, how could it be that through organizing alone, these quote-unquote inferior people were able to dismantle Jim Crow? How is it possible that black culture, whether you're talking about rock and roll, blues, hip-hop, jazz music, has taken over the world? How is it possible that a black man ascended to the highest echelons of the American government? These people are supposed to be inferior to us. How is it that we're losing out? How is it that white students on campus are no longer the dominant students, right? There's fewer and fewer people in the highest universities who are, kind of Anglo-Saxon, etc. How could that be? And the answer that they came up with is that there must be some all-powerful, nefarious cabal that's pulling the strings and that's undermining the natural ascent of the superior people to the position of supremacy, right? And who is that cabal? It's the Jews, right? I didn't even have to say it, well, no. And this is what we're talking about. So when you spend a lot of time on these white supremacist websites and fora online, as we do at the ADL, it's our job. What you find is that, like the quote that I read from Andrew Anglin, the Jews are the source of all that is evil, right? They're behind, the bad immigration policies, they're behind feminism, they're behind the gay agenda, trying to, destroy the white family unit. So there is an inherent, there's an inherent interest in all of us coming together to fight all of these bigotries because they all are very much interlinked and they depend on one another for their perpetual oppression of us.
So can you explain the split between David Duke and his wing, who is very anti-Israel, and Richard Spencer, who has called himself a Zionist?
Yeah, Richard Spencer. Look, a lot of these guys like to put on an air of respectability, and even in intellectual kind of superiority, right? They wear suits and ties, and they're not like the Nazis with the jackboots and everything, because they want to be seen as respectable and they want to mainstream their ideologies. And David Duke, look, I mean, he's Dr. David Duke, right? He has a PhD. Richard Spencer was on his way to a PhD and he dropped out of the program. Look, Richard Spencer doesn't know a lot about Israel, right? But let's just put it out there. I mean, this isn't exactly his model country for what he's trying to create in the United States. You know, we have Sharia courts in Israel, right? You have minorities better represented in the Israeli Knesset than minorities are in the U.S. Congress here. I mean, it's not exactly his idea of a model society, but he threw out this term that he's a white supremacist. When you actually get down to it, most white supremacists are very hostile to Israel and Zionism. Right, they say so. I mean, you have. I mentioned Patrick Little earlier. You know, he talks about the Zionist agenda incessantly. You think about Arthur Jones, the candidate, the GOP candidate out of Illinois, right? Same thing. He goes on. You know, what this party is about is smashing the queer movement, sending back all the illegals who are taking our jobs, smashing the Zionist movement. And on and on and on and on. There is this false trope that has been passed around equating Zionism with racism, Zionism with white supremacy. I mean, we should see that for what it is, right? Which is as a way to delegitimize a people's movement for self-determination. It's an ugly smear. It's one that was widely rejected back in the day back in the 70s when the UN passed the Zionism equals racism resolution. You have people like Byron Rustin, you had Rosa Parks, you had Coretta Scott King, Ralph Abernathy, all these civil rights leaders who took out an ad in the New York Times saying, we know Zionism is not racism based on our 400 years of experience with segregation, discrimination, slavery, etc. We know it's not racism, but the legitimate expression of the Jewish people's self-determination. Right? These are their words. Every movement for rights is always going to come under attack. There is going to be smeared. It's going to be people are going to try to delegitimize it. Whether we're talking about Black Lives Matter, whether we're talking about the Me Too movement, whether we're talking about Zionism. You just have to expect it.
So earlier this year, the leader of the Women's March, Linda Sansour, famously stated that Zionism and feminism are incompatible. And locally, we've heard from progressive Jews who feel increasingly alienated from social justice groups because of Israel politics. Does the exclusion of advocates for Israel from progressive institutions and movements constitute anti-Semitism? And as a follow-up on that, what has been your experience in social justice movements and in other causes?
First.
Okay, I've been speaking so much. I feel like
I
got fast though.
I think that exclusion, or the potential for that exclusion, is very unfortunate, particularly in the present circumstances. We kind of need all hands on deck. It's very counterproductive. It comes from that one-size-fits-all mentality that we were talking about before, about apartheid and colonization. It comes from the framing that progressives sometimes do, that is, they see Israel and the Palestinians in this tiny little frame of just the land of Israel, and they tend not to see a larger frame of Israel in the Middle East. My experiences in San Jose have been very positive. Our focus is basically on domestic issues in the different interfaith organizations that I participate in. And when you participate and you are a friend, then you have friends. So one outgrowth of some of the work that we've done with Pat is there's an effort to pair rabbis with Presbyterian ministers because of the issues in the Presbyterian Church, and I have a partner, and we are partners together, Reverend Brian Franzen and I, partners for peace in the Middle East. So I think that even though you hear a lot about these issues of exclusion, that hasn't been my experience. After there was this issue of the Black Lives Matter group in New York and the negative statement about Israel and Zionism in their platform, I had spoke to some African American leaders that I work with out here in San Jose, and they had not heard about it, even though every Jew in America must have heard about it. It was in every Jewish magazine. And it didn't at all express their views or the way things operated in San Jose.
So, Linda actually, I don't know if you can call it, she may have walked back her statement. She clarified, at least, in an interview that she did subsequently, where she said, well, if you believe in the self-determination and human rights of the Palestinians, then you are welcome in the feminist movement, right? So actually, if we apply her calculus to Jews, right, if Zionism is, the standard definition of Zionism is this self-determination, the right to self-determination of the Jewish people, if we apply our calculus, then actually, as it turns out, you can't be anti-Zionist and feminist by her own calculus, right? If you believe in the self-determination of the Jewish people and their human rights, then you are welcome in the feminist movement. So I welcome all of our Zionist brothers and sisters into that movement then. But this phenomenon is actually, it's not so new, right? Hannah Arendt, in her seminal work on the origins of totalitarianism, talks about this notion of the good Jew, right? And she describes a situation where in the 19th century kind of intellectual and aristocratic circles of Berlin, Jews were admitted on the condition that they could pass certain litmus tests, right? And prove themselves to be the good Jew. And to do so, she writes, quote, they had to stand out as an individual who could be congratulated on being an exception from the Jew, and thus from the people as a whole. So the Jew is thus admitted into these spaces only on the condition of rejecting or opposing his or her own people while still being identified as one of them. Right, so this is the marginalization of Jews from certain spaces on the condition of unless they can pass certain tests is not so new. But to answer your question, I would say that it's anti-Semitic. We talk about, at the ADL, we use a teaching tool called the Pyramid of Hate. And it talks about, it's a visual way to understand how bigotry escalates from belittling jokes and racist slurs and epithets to economic, housing discrimination, political discrimination, etc., to violence, arson, assault, etc., and at the very top, of course, is genocide. And the second rung of that pyramid is social marginalization or social isolation. That's what this is. Right? It's saying that you cannot play with us unless unless you pass certain tests that we, as non-Jews, have set forth for you. And also get to think about what is the effect? What is the effect of marginalizing Zionists from any space? Right? Well, we know, according to research that has been done in here in the United States, actually JCRC did some of this research in the Bay Area, as well as in England and in Israel, upwards of 90% of Jews identify as Zionists. So, in terms of how these policies would actually play out, you're going to marginalize more than 9 out of every 10 Jews by excluding them from these spaces. Yes, that's anti-Semitic. When we talk about establishing whether something is, some policy, for example, is discriminatory or not, there's two standards. There's one where you have to prove intent, that the intent of this policy was discriminatory, and then, which is really hard, right? Because in some ways you're guessing as to the mentality of the person carrying it out. And then the other standard is disparate impact. If you can show that there's a disparate impact on one community over another, then that policy is in fact discriminatory. So yeah, if you're marginalizing 90% of Jews and pushing them out of certain spaces, in effect, it's anti-Semitic, whatever the intent may have been.
Thank you. So I'm just going to ask 2 more questions, and then we're going to turn it over to you. Just a reminder, if you'd like a question card, please flag or turn in your question cards to Jessica or other staff that is around the room. Reverend Smith, in the last several years, we have seen the building of solidarity between communities of color, particularly the African American community, and groups supporting the Palestinians in the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. Can you give us a little background? Why is that happening and what's going on with it?
The other day I had this great opportunity to meet a young lady. Her name is Tara Thompson. She was one of the lead organizers of Ferguson. And I started asking her questions, and I started saying to her, why wasn't your movement really with the church? And she said, what the great thing is? The people from the church, they showed up during the daytime, but at night, when there was tear gas and the police were beating us, they would never open the door. And she said, they were never there in the dark. You have to understand, marginalized people look for partners or people that reach out to them. So if you spend 200 days on the streets of Ferguson, or you see Eric Garner, Tamir Rice, all these other things happening, and then somebody says, that's the same thing that's happening in my space, then it becomes an easier question. Because sometimes it's not about right or wrong, it's more about silence and speaking. So if we can sit here and watch communities go through these issues, and then somebody else says, I know what you're feeling, let's come alongside of you, right or wrong, you're going to reach out to the hand that helps you. And I think that is a significant part around BDS and why people are seeing it oftentimes, particularly in the African American community, is because we were silent. We didn't say anything. We watched it at home. And then when it becomes something that becomes an issue for us, now we want to engage in it. It's not right. And that is the challenge. I mean, there was another question, and I'm going to go back to it, where we talk about the Black Lives Matter movement. Black people are not homogeneous. But there's some real, and there's some real pain and some real issues, and there's real reasons why movements like BLM aren't involved, not only in the church, they're not involved in the church, and they're not involved in the regular structures, because we failed them also. And I think the question becomes, how do we build those bridges, and how do we as Americans and American Jewish community, American Black community, start reclaiming a generation and really having constructive conversations, is we have to be there in the dark. So when I hear something that affects the Jewish community, I need to stand for it because it's wrong, whatever that effect is. And we would expect that the Jewish community stand with us. That's how we started NAACP, right? Yes. That's how we had the Freedom Way. But after 67, you don't hear about that happening anymore. And that's where you see that critical thing. Another thing is, I think, is this on Facebook? Yeah, I'll say it anyway. I think sometimes the American church has become over-politicized. How can I claim to care about you and not care about somebody else? So I'm saying my faith, my demand of my faith as a Christian is to care for the least, the lost, the lonely, is to care for my brother that God is creating in the image, unless they're from this country. unless they don't match my desire to save somebody. So that's the challenge, right? I think, and I call leaders out in churches that have a colonial mentality where they always want to save somebody instead of trying to really get in relationships with people and figure it out and spend time and years in the Middle East and meet the Jewish women and the Muslim women that are meeting in Jerusalem and investing in those opportunities instead of trying to create destructive and newsline kind of cycles.
Right.
So that's it.
And this is a two-part final question. The first part is, how do we open up that conversation to Reverend Smith? And the second part is, what do our other two panelists have to share about how we can address this? What kind of response can we have in the community?
I think the reality, there's a couple of different places and approaches. Have an opinion on the things that are happening in our country. Like, is there a statement that needs to happen around what happened to Eric Garner in New York City? Or Tamir Rice in Cleveland? Is that not a statement? Should we say that the policing in Black communities that marginalize and are preying on the community, we've seen this before in our past, and we can't allow that to happen in America. That's instant credibility. Just saying this is wrong. There's some political capital there. Like, people the more you say it, the more people will be like, well, they said they were wrong the last time, and this time, and this time, and they're coming alongside me when I have to protest at the march, and they're helping with the legal fees, when we take police officers and do the civil rights, the civil court actions, and then people start going, you know what, these are partners. I can't have somebody use cliches and come across the ocean and say, hey, they're doing the same thing as the other ones. That's really the trick right there. Because once you partner with people, they start believing you. You know, that's been my experience.
Yeah, so I would definitely echo what the Reverend just said. You know, for me, one of the highlights of my career in Yale was getting to work with Dr. King's lawyer, friend, political advisor, draft speechwriters, wrote part of the famous "I Have a Dream" speech after Clarence Jones. And one of the things that he said to me was that the success that we had, as I'm speaking, the success that we had in the civil rights movement in elevating the conscience of the United States was achieved through the alliance we had with the American Jewish community. Anybody who says otherwise, wasn't there, does not know, or is lying to you. And that's something that I've carried with me to inspire my own work. I also, you know, you mentioned after '67 there was this kind of breakdown of this solidarity and joint activism between the communities. One of the posters that I have in my office at ADL is of Rabbi. Right? He's one of my personal heroes. And of course, he's one of my heroes because of what he achieved in the United States during the civil rights movement, but also because he kept going after that, right? He was involved in so many international solidarity efforts, including the Soviet Jewry movement, which secured the rights of me and my family to be able to come to the United States and get out of a place where we were subjected to, state-sanctioned anti-Semitism. And that's something that I always, take inspiration from. And I think, also we have to acknowledge, if we want to create solidarity and joint activism amongst communities going forward, then we have to also acknowledge and be grateful for what was done in the past. Right, so we know that many Jewish people were very involved in the civil rights movement. Far fewer of us know the role that the African American community played in supporting Jews, going all the way back to the 1800s. Right, so when there was massive pogroms, right, mass anti-Jewish violence happening in Eastern Europe, where I come from, the black press was one of the areas that was bringing this to the attention of American audiences, right? You had people like Timothy Thomas Fortune writing about the plight of our Jewish brethren across the sea, and the ways that the parallels between the violence being directed against African Americans in the United States and the violence directed against Jewish communities in Eastern Europe. You had committees of black lawyers that got together, drafted resolutions calling on the American government to put pressure on the Tsar to protect his Jewish citizens, or else to offer refuge to these people, right? You had black churches that collected funds to send across the sea to Ukraine, right, to the Pale of Settlement, to repair Jewish communities that had been destroyed, decimated by racist violence that was directed against Jews. Most people don't know anything about this, right? And if we forget the ways that people stood with us in the past, then we can't expect them to stand with us in the future. Nor can we just rely on the past and say, like, well, wasn't it nice that Abraham Joshua Heschel marched with Dr. King? We also have to, as you said, continue to be active and to be involved and to put ourselves in places that may be a little uncomfortable. In the dark spots, right? When nighttime falls and the police come out, in militarized gear, that's the proving ground. That's the proving ground of how invested you are in the liberation of other people. And when people see that you are in fact invested, they will be much more likely to stand with you in the difficult times when you experience them, I think.
So I feel like I'm preaching to the choir here, because I know the JCRC has really spoken out over and over again to say that Jewish issues are not just the issues that concern the Jewish community. These are all Jewish issues. And it's very important that we be engaged on all these different issues, whether that's housing or criminal justice reform, or any of the other issues that affect all of us as a society and a community. And that we go in not taking advantage of some of the privilege and experiences we've had to lead necessarily or to help, but to stand in solidarity and to be allies and to work together. And sometimes that's a little bit tricky for Jews who are used to talking so much. I'll say it truthfully. And I think quite often we will discover that these are the same issues. We had one experience down in San Jose, I guess it was a year and a half ago, when it became clear through the revelation of the texts and emails of the sheriff department that not only were they racist and anti-immigrant and anti-Asian and anti-everything, they were anti-Jewish in a very dramatic way, and how important it is for us all to work in solidarity. So I think that's the message we want to take away this evening.
Okay, thank you. So I have... So the question is asking you to do a role play. I think I won't ask you to do that. However, I will ask you this question, and trying to get at the issue that's behind it. So can you role play out a conversation with Linda Sansour when you point out how her anti-Israel, anti-Zionism statements are anti-Semitic? How would she respond, and how would you then respond? And the question I would relate that to is, how in general do you open up that kind of conversation with somebody, particularly when it relates to issues around social justice, inclusion of Zionists in social justice spheres, that kind of thing?
So I never met Linda Sansour, but
This is a theoretical.
Yeah, but we had an experience not so different from this when a African-American woman preacher gave a sermon to a mixed group, and she had just come back from Palestine, and she was full of fervor and had no sense of the impact of her words on a group that included Jewish participants. And the only thing that really made a conversation possible with some of the other people is that I knew them from before. If I were first meeting these people and came to first say, oh my goodness, you can't say that, there's no basis for conversation. But because some of these people were people I had worked with for over a decade, then you're able to say, I want you to think for a minute how this sounded to me. Let me share with you what this experience was like when I heard those words. But you can only say that if there's been a basis of interaction before, and that's the reason we need to go out and be engaged.
Yeah, I don't want to get too far into Linda Sansour. I think she's taken up an inordinate amount of our communal energy and discussion. She's one woman. I think she's an important, certainly an important leader for many communities. But I would just say that any of these conversations need to begin with an acknowledgement of the humanity of people involved, right? When you're talking about something as painful and drawn out as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the very first thing that we have to come to it with is a sense of humanity, right? People are suffering. Palestinians are suffering, right? Before we start pointing fingers and trying to figure out who's the cause of their suffering and all that, let's just first acknowledge people are suffering, right? And if we can acknowledge that very human experience of suffering that we all have and we can all relate to, then I think that creates a basis from which we can then grow and have productive conversations. Even if at the end of it we don't end up agreeing on every point, I think acknowledging one another's humanity is always a good starting point.
Thank you. So I have another question, and I'm actually going to take the liberty of changing it a little bit and asking a question that we ran out of time for. So JVP are among very strident critics of Israel. And a lot of times they use their Jewishness to avoid accusations of being called anti-Semitic. As a Jewish people, we also often hold ourselves to a higher standard. The Jewish people, and by extension, the nation of Israel, are supposed to be a light unto the nation. yet we call it a double standard when we see non-Jews doing this. So how to relate to that? What's this double standard, and how are Jews that make these kind of statements, what's the relationship, and how are they used to essentially cover for what would be called anti-Semitism in any other context?
Come on, first one.
So, every community has these people who go against the grain of the community, right? Who reject the predominant views of their community. We have different names for them in different communities, but we all have them, right? I don't want to get into talking too much about JVP. I do enough of that as is, but this does present me with the opportunity on the question of double standards, which are the hallmark of every kind of bigotry, by the way, right? It's one set of rules for me and another set of rules for you. If a white person uses drugs, then you go to rehab. If a black person uses drugs, they're 4 times as likely to go to jail. That's a double standard, right?
It's a medical epidemic, and it's a war on drugs. It depends on the race.
That's right. It's either a medical epidemic or a war on drugs. So Bayard Rustin, had this to say about double standards. He said, and by the way, this is a man who comes out of the Quaker tradition, right? He's a pacifist. He was, he taught Dr. King most of what he knew about nonviolent resistance, right? He said this: the nations of the world, while prepared to use violence to further their own interests, seem to demand pacifist behavior from Israel. It is immoral for such nations to denounce Israel's use of force in achieving its objectives while finding ample rationalization for their own violence. And he continued, the irony of this double standard is that Israel itself accepts it, holding itself to a higher standard of conduct than the rest of the world. Right? He said this, by the way, in the wake of the invasion of Lebanon by Israel. I think he visited the region in 1982. This was his reflections on that. But what he was expressing is a basic principle, certainly of anti-racist organizing, and I think a basic principle of human decency, which is that you do not ask somebody else to do that which you are yourself not willing to do. Right? So you don't. So it's true. Like, you have these standards that are set forward for Israel, which nobody else seems to be willing to apply to themselves. And I think it's a kind of, when we talk about matters of existential threats, right? You're actually what you're actually doing is devaluing human lives. So if you're saying that, let's say, coming back to the question of, anti-Zionism and whether it's anti-Semitic, well, you can have a position, as I said, as an anarchist who says I'm against all nation states, and therefore, I'm not anti-Semitic because I'm applying the standard equally. In theory, that's true. There's no double standard, so it's perhaps not anti-Semitic. What's the effect, though, right? If the effect of dismantling the Jewish state is another Holocaust, then in effect, that is an anti-Semitic policy. We can agree, let's say, on the notion that maybe the nation state is not the optimal form of social organization and governance. But why is it incumbent upon one of the most persecuted and vulnerable groups in history to genocide to be the first to dismantle their state and tear down their borders and disband their army? Let's start with somebody who hasn't had that kind of history, right?
And
So
to add.
it's definitely unfair to have double standards. We talked about that a little bit when we talked about America, right? We accept that there are things that are imperfect about our country, and that doesn't render it illegitimate. But I think sometimes in the Jewish community, we don't hold standards that we hold for ourselves in these public forums. And I want to just speak, we're in a very difficult period right now. And I'm sure everyone saw the picture of David Friedman in front of that map where Al-Aqsa was removed and instead they placed in the temple. And that to me looked so analogous to the complaint that we've made so many times about the textbooks in Arab countries or the maps that are online where Israel is removed. And we can't complain about one and not complain about the other. If we're loving parents, if we're good friends, we don't hold back sometimes about warning our good friend or speaking to our child. about things that need to be done. And I know it's very difficult and it's very frightening because of the anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism that does exist in the world, but if we want to be a good friend, then we need to say outright to those things that are not right.
Okay, and we only have time for one final question. So this one, I believe, is directed at Reverend Smith. So can you speak about the fact that there are so many evangelical Christians at the embassy ceremony and that their ultimate aim is the destruction of Israel? And I'm gonna actually add a little onto that question as well. Which is, talk to me a little bit about the different approaches between evangelical church, evangelicals in general, and the more liberal Protestant churches when it comes to Israel. Because we see a very big difference, and as this person pointed out, some people believe that the ultimate aim of evangelicals is very different than the ultimate aim of what Jews would have in mind for Israel.
Okay, so there's a couple of things. I would caution the use of the word evangelical. It is a very broad strokes. Like all groups, there are those that are on the fringes. Well, not on the fringes, but there is a segment that is, I'm going in trouble for saying this, but I'm going to say it anyway, that have traits of like what ISIS has. They're very fundamentalist. There's a lot of theological study that is going on right now talking about that there's this fundamentalist trend in Christian America that is very dogmatic, very destructive, and I predict in the next 15 to 20 years you'll see a split between the group that calls themselves evangelical. Because I know some really good men and women, some of my prayer partners and some of them I actually ate breakfast with this morning, and they thought the buffoonery and the fake pageantry that happened in Jerusalem was counterproductive, was political ploys, was distraction from a Russian investigation. There is a million other reasons that they look at that event. Now, mainline Christians tend to be, and I can't speak for everybody, so that's why I'm trying to really be careful in my statements. Most mainline Christians understand, like my original statement, that this is not a zero-sum game. In order to push you up, I gotta step on somebody else's neck. So when we look at it from my perspective, I said, what is the Christian thing to do that shows love and care and compassion to both sides, and understanding that both sides have experienced significant trauma, and what does that work out, and understand there's colonialism and racism and all kind of things that are there that we don't understand. So how do we work through that? And I think that's a more mainline approach. The other thing is that these same evangelicals will also, that grouping that was there will be the same ones that will tell black boys that are being shot and beat by police, just stand there and don't resist. They're also the same ones that say, it's a God-given right to have a gun after a school shooting. So you got to look at the trend of their thinking. It's not indicative of my faith. And I think that's very careful. Don't give, I'm pretty sure you all have radical rabbis.
Yeah. Every religion has its fringe extremists, fundamentalists.
And you don't want to give these people too much oxygen. You really don't. And unfortunately, we have those in our current government that will give anybody with a conspiracy theory a tank of oxygen, a news broadcast, time to talk, and we can't let these people dominate the conversation. And it's unfortunate that our government has sanctioned this foolishness. I mean, can I say one thing? Because See, I'm not.
Last word.
Yeah, it's interesting that these gentlemen that are supposed to be Christians were picked by a president that couldn't say Corinthians
What?
in the Bible.
Yeah.
He mispronounced the book of the Bible. You understand? So you get what I'm saying? Like so. Just because you have a certain clothes on or a certain title doesn't make you representative of a faith or a group. You could say I am this, but if your actions aren't that.
Okay, well, thank you very much.